No worries. Thanks, Rob. And thanks to the Study Centre for putting this together and sponsoring it. I'm just putting the link for today's sutta in the chat if anyone's missed it. Oh, by the way, look what I just happen to have beside me is a book of Sutta Central's translations. Oh, how fortuitous. So anyway, if you want to read things the proper way, that means the old-fashioned way, then you can get it. So you can order the books via Sutta Central, and we all know that reading on paper is better, right? Especially when it's something meaningful. So this is why we embrace old school technology. Actually, when we launched these books, we did it at the National Library here in Sydney, and I went into the reading room of the library just to check it out, and I was kind of distressed to see that of all of the people, like 100 people sitting in the reading room, precisely 0 were actually reading books. They were all looking at screens in the library. But anyway, I guess that's the future. Okay, so yeah, I want to begin by acknowledging the Barramadigal people of the Darug Nation on whose land I am sitting today. So I'm near Parramatta in the west of Sydney, and this was their ancestral land, and this has never been ceded. So we live as guests on their land, and we pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and bear in mind their custodianship of the land that lasted for tens of thousands of years, during which time they transformed this landscape, according to all accounts, into a beautiful verdant parkland. And in the space of 100 and something years, we've managed to convert it all into a concrete wasteland. Anyway, so maybe we have a lesson or something to learn there. So yeah, so good to see you all here for this series of talks. Now, first thing, may I ask, if you can turn your camera on, then I appreciate that, just to let you know, just because, then I can see who it is that I'm talking to. So thanks if you can. If you can't, if you're watching this on the toilet or something like that, then please do keep the cameras off out of compassion for all the sentient beings here. Thank you. Now, during this talk, I will be checking the chat. So please do check that. If you have any questions or anything you'd like to contribute or whatever, then please just pop that into the chat. We're going to be doing a series of 4 classes, and each class we're going to look at one sutta, and we're going to start out with a relatively short and simple one and gradually get a bit more complicated as we go. I want to just mention that I'm going to be doing a similar course with the Barry Centre in a couple of months. But if you're wondering about that, these 2 courses will be structured in a similar way, but they'll have different content. So I'll be looking at different suttas for the Barry course. So if you want to join up for that one later, then you won't be disappointed. Well, maybe you will be disappointed, but you won't be disappointed because of hearing the same suttas again. You'll be disappointed for other, no doubt, perfectly valid reasons. All right. So yes, I wanted to ask. Now, is there anybody here who doesn't know what the suttas are? I assume most people have some familiarity with the suttas or what the idea of the suttas are. If anyone could just pop into chat, don't be embarrassed. If this is your first journey into the suttas, then that's great, and I'll just spend a bit of time to make sure that you're not lost. So please do pop that into chat. But I assume most people have a reasonable knowledge, at least, of what the suttas are and a bit of the background in them and so on. So I'm going to be moving ahead on that basis. So for today, we're going to be looking at the Dhanya Sutta, Sutta Nipata number 1.2. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about the approach that I'm going to be using for this series. So Vandana mentions that she's started reading Majjhima Nikaya by Bhikkhu Bodhi. That's good enough. You should make sure you read the introduction. It's really good. So I want to begin by just situating what we are going to be doing, or the approach that I'm going to be trying to make in this course in relation to what's happened before with the suttas. So we do have a message from one person. So it's the first time that they're learning about the suttas. Thank you so much for letting me know. I'm going to give you a bit of background information and so hopefully give you a bit of orientation, okay? So the Buddha taught roughly 2,500 years ago. And in that time, he taught over a period of about 45 years. And he gave many teachings which his disciples memorized. And those memorized teachings form the basis of what we call the suttas today. So they were organized into collections that we call the Tipitaka, and those collections were passed down in the Buddhist community. So the suttas are part of the core Buddhist teachings of all the schools of Buddhism. So this is one important point to bear in mind. So what we're going to be looking at today and during this course are teachings that don't belong to one or other school of Buddhism, but they in fact belong to the common heritage of all Buddhists. Nonetheless, the specific tradition that we're drawing from today is the Theravada tradition, which has handed down its scriptures in the Pali language. So these are the oldest, best preserved and most consistent set of early Buddhist scriptures that we have. So when we study what the Buddha taught, then the Pali suttas are really the core or the foundation of that study, even though there are, of course, many suttas outside of the Pali traditions as well. This particular sutta doesn't have any parallels outside of Pali, though the one we're looking at today, it only exists in Pali canon. Okay, so this is a bit of background on the suttas themselves. So when we look at that, when we study the suttas, then we are studying what we often refer to as early Buddhism. And so that means the Buddhism as taught by the Buddha, as learned and practiced by his students, and as memorized and passed down in the early Buddhist community. So early Buddhism, of course, happened a long time ago, happened 2,500 years ago. So what we are doing is not early Buddhism, we are doing what is right now, in fact, the very latest form of Buddhism that exists. This is like right cutting edge late Buddhism right here. But we are learning about and learning from those early teachings, which in my view is an intrinsic part of all Buddhist traditions. I think Buddhist traditions find renewal by going back to the source. And there are any number of ways in which Buddhist traditions have been transformed, revolutionized, modernized, criticized, enlivened through reference to and learning from the teachings that we find in the suttas. So this is an ongoing practice. So for me, I'm not too worried about whether, what school of Buddhism people come from, or indeed if they come from a school of Buddhism at all. To me, those things are not really that important. But what we are, I think, unified by is the fact that we think that these suttas are interesting and worthwhile, and that we want to learn from what the Buddha was teaching. So this is just a bit of a general background to the suttas and to the study of why we study the suttas. Now to come on to the particular approach that I'm going to be using in this course. So I sort of was thinking about this a little while ago, and I came up with like 4 stages in the modern development of sutta understanding. And I'm going to talk about those 4 stages now. And I'm just going to say these 4 stages are purely personal, okay? Maybe they don't make any sense or apply to anyone else, but they kind of make sense to me. Okay, the first stage I would characterize as the archaeological stage. And this begins around mid-19th century to the first part of the 20th century. And this means like literal archaeology in terms of going to India and other places and digging up the soil and discovering old buildings there and recovering the places that the Buddha lived and all of the geography of where he lived and where he taught. But it also means the textual archaeology in the sense of establishing the historical strata of text. And so this was established in that period. And the main findings of that period remain the consensus among early Buddhist scholars today. Of course, it's been nuanced and so on since then, but the basic idea remains the same. One of the things that does is when you have strata of texts, then you can meaningfully ask, well, this is the teaching that we are taught today, And well, this is the teaching that we find in the suttas. So are they the same or different? And how did we get from one to the other by these different stages? So we start to be able to meaningfully ask questions on a historical basis about these things. Now, that doesn't mean that a historical basis is the only thing that matters, okay? We don't get all fundamentalist on me, all right? It's just a way of looking at things that can help to clarify certain issues. It can help to eliminate certain kinds of mistakes that we tend to make about things. For example, it's a very overriding tendency that we tend to project ourselves into what we are reading. And so when we read something, we will tend to assume that this is us, and we tend to read our concerns, our problems, our issues, our prejudices into that text. Now that's fine, okay? That's normal. We have to do that. That's how you develop empathy. But using a historical method gives you a way of reflecting on that and to be able to say, oh, actually, maybe these things also meant something different to those people at that time. And so then that can give us a richer way of seeing things. So it's not to say that all we can do is situate these as a historical text, but it does mean to say that situating it as a historical text is a rich kind of inquiry that allows us to ask certain kinds of questions and answer certain kinds of questions that we would otherwise not be able to. So this is the one of the positive sides of this archaeological phase, and that positive side led to massive and widespread reforms throughout all forms of Buddhism. And this is what's known as Buddhist modernism. So basically any form of Buddhism that you're likely to encounter is some form of Buddhist modernism in one way or another. Certainly anything you encounter on Zoom, obviously, but everything has been affected by modernity, and that goes back a lot longer than we think. We find, for example, things like, say, the forest tradition, right? So if you look at my robe's the color of the forest tradition. This is the color of the jackfruit tree, which was used by the monks in the Ajahn Chah tradition that I ordained in. This is artificial dye, of course, but when I was a young monk, we would actually make it out of the jackfruit. So Ajahn Chah was a reformed teacher who in many ways rejected the normative Buddhism of his time in Thailand. And his teaching was inspired by return to things like mindfulness of breathing, emphasis on ethical conduct rather than, say, magical rituals and amulets, right? Emphasis on understanding impermanence and wisdom sides of Buddhism. And that itself was informed by the previous reform of Thai Buddhism under the reign of King Mongkut. King Mongkut, a famous intellectual, famous scholar, who undertook this historical reform of Thai Buddhism. I don't want to go too much into those details, but I just want to say that this idea that Buddhism has responded to the challenges of modernity goes back to the start. It's not just something that we're doing today. It's something that underlies all of the traditions that we encounter. So this is the archaeological phase. Okay, now I'm getting a bit of a light appearing behind me. I'm just going to take a break for 1 second and just go and draw the curtain there just to stop that halo, if you can excuse me. Okay, hopefully that's a bit better. All right. So that's a good part of the archaeological phase. A bad part of it is that when you can say, well, here's Buddhism as we find it, and here's early Buddhism, and now we can say, well, what early Buddhism is, you tend to get quite a few imaginative takes on what early Buddhism is. And suddenly we've empowered everyone to come along and say, oh, I know what real Buddhism is. And it's easy to look at traditions and say, oh, these traditions are full of rubbish. Traditions are big things. There's like hundreds of millions of people in Buddhist traditions. Of course you can find lots of things that are rubbish there. So it becomes very easy to make a new take on what early Buddhism is. And many of those takes are interesting. Some of them kind of unhinged. And you get these very kind of exotic and ungrounded takes on what early Buddhism was, which started to appear with the influence of things like the Theosophists and Vedantins and so on in the mid-20th century. So in reaction to that, you then have what I would consider the second phase of understanding suttas. This is the neoclassical phase, or neo-traditionalist phase, or something like that. And so this is where people started to say, yes, we accept those results of the historical research, but we're not going to see such a sort of a great chasm between early Buddhism and Buddhism of today, but we're going to see more of a continuity of tradition. And so the great sort of German monks of mid-20th century, Nyanaponika and Nyantiloka, and their lineage, as well as many of the great Sri Lankan scholars, Kalapahana, Vijayasekara, Malalasekara, and so on, as well as reformers like I would say Ajahn Chah, Ajahn Buddhadasa, and others would fit into that kind of category. So these were people who were not afraid to make reforms or suggest changes to their tradition, but who stopped short of dismissing the tradition totally and emphasized continuity. So that form of Buddhism formed, I believe, the basis for the majority of what we consider Theravada Buddhism today. So we, that was where like the insight meditation traditions and so on came from. So it was, again, hugely influential. But it tends to have, the drawback of it is it tends to mask the fact that modern Theravada Buddhism is in fact quite different from early Buddhism. So we tend to risk losing our ability to make that distinction, and people don't really notice that that distinction is there. Moving on to then the third stage, which I would call this the comparative stage. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work of Venerable Analayo, and he's of course the most prolific and most influential scholar working in that area. But of course he's not far from the only one. His work is inspired by work by, say, Master Yin Shun in Taiwan, Master Thich Mun Chau from Vietnam, and many others who have done work in this comparative Buddhist field. So the comparative Buddhist field says that the suttas are not just something that belongs to the Pali tradition, but something that belongs to the common heritage of all Buddhism. And so they look at all of those things. So that has the advantage of bringing study of the suttas out of a sectarian context and grounding it in a more universal context. But it does have a limitation because it can only bring us back to 100 or 200 years after the Buddha, when the sects started to appear and the texts started to diverge. So we can learn a lot through that method, but there are also limits to what we can learn, as there are with any kind of method. Which then brings us to what we're going to be doing for this course, which is I would call a dialectical approach. So a dialectical approach sees the suttas as a conversation between the Buddha and his students and other people in their society at the time. And this is what we're really going to be focusing on here, is conversations. And one of the things that's really interesting about these conversations is that they show the Buddha speaking with people who are not Buddhist. This is really important. I just want to pause on this point for a minute, okay? Almost all Buddhist literature consists of Buddhists talking to other Buddhists. And this is the case for almost everything in Buddhism from the period after the suttas up until the modern era. Buddhists talking to other Buddhists. And that change happened very rapidly. So in the suttas, we constantly find the Buddha and other Buddhists talking to people who are not Buddhist all the time, and all different kinds of people about all different kinds of things. And yet, very soon, that was no longer the case. Even, say, 100 years, 200 years after the Buddha, that wasn't really happening anymore. And so this, to me, is a very strong indication that we are, in fact, dealing with texts that arise from that period before the school split, which is a comparative study can bring us back to. They bring us to that time of the first generation of Buddhists who were wandering around a country that was not Buddhist and talking to people who weren't Buddhist about things that were not Buddhist. And you find this constantly in the suttas. The Buddha is constantly talking about different ideas and philosophies that are simply not Buddhist. And the knowledge and the acknowledgement of this is rarely pursued within the Buddhist community, even to this day. So when I'm doing my work of studying and annotating the texts, I constantly find things that suggest the Buddha is quoting from or referring to or having a knowledge of things we find in Brahmanical or Jaina texts. And yet these, as far as I know, have never been noticed by the scholarly community. Not just once or twice, it happens like all the time because people tend to be siloed in their different areas. So over the course of these few weeks, we're going to be looking at some of these texts, and we're going to be learning, hopefully, a little bit about what these other scriptures are, who these other people were that the Buddha was talking to, and how the Buddha responded to those people, and how that might affect and hopefully enrich our understanding of the suttas. So that's enough of an introduction. So one of the reasons I'm doing a shortish sutta for today is because I knew that the introduction would be a bit long. So I do apologize for a slightly overlong introduction, but I just wanted to give some context for that. Now, how would you like to do this? Would you like me to screen share the sutta as we read it? Is that a good idea? Okay, I'm going to try to, what I'm going to do is this, and so on. Okay, good. Oh, by the way, if you go back to the top of the chat, you'll see I put this in there because I'm very proud and I wanted to promote it. But I got an article published in the Guardian the other day, so with my dear friend Nadine Levy, and so I was really proud of that about Buddhism and climate change. So please do check that out. Bit of shameless self-promotion there. Okay, so let me try to do some screen sharing. So what I'm going to do is read through the text. So to begin with, let's just have a bit of a review of Sutta Central and how it works. So we're on this particular sutta, Sutta Nipata number 1.2. Here we have some information about it. That's boring. Then we can change our views here. So here I can just choose to have a plain view without any footnotes. Here we go. So that's just a nice reading view without any complications. And I'm going to read through and then we can look at the other things. This button here gives parallels and that's some other details. And the voice button with the speaker, that lets you listen to the sutta if you want to. Thanks to Carl Lu, our wonderful volunteer. All right. So Sutta Nipata number 1.2, the wealthy rancher, Dhaniya Sutta. I'll just read through the sutta to begin. I've boiled my rice and drawn my milk, said Dhaniya the rancher. I stay with my family along the bank of the Mahi. My hut is roofed, my sacred fire kindled, so reign, sky god, if you wish. I boil not with anger and have drawn out hard-heartedness, said the Buddha. I stay for one night along the bank of the Mahi. My hut is wide open, my fire is quenched, so reign, sky god, if you wish. No gadflies or mosquitoes are found, said Dhaniya. Cows graze on the lush meadow grass. They get by even when the rain comes, so reign, sky god, if you wish. I bound a raft and made it well, said the Buddha, and with it I crossed over, went to the far shore and dispelled the flood. Now I have no need for a raft, so reign, sky god, if you wish. My wife is obedient, not wanton, said Dhaniya. Long have we lived together happily. I hear nothing bad about her, so reign, sky god, if you wish. My mind is obedient and freed, said the Buddha, long nurtured and well tamed. Nothing bad is found in me, so reign, sky god, if you wish. I'm self-employed, said Dhaniya, and my healthy children likewise. I hear nothing bad about them, so reign, sky god, if you wish. I am no one's lackey, said the Buddha. With what I've earned, I wander the world. I've no need for wages, so reign, sky god, if you wish. I have heifers and sucklings, said Dhaniya, cows and calf and breeding cows. I've also got a bull, leader of the herd here, so reign, sky god, if you wish. I have no heifers or sucklings, said the Buddha, no cows and calf or breeding cows. I haven't got a bull, leader of the herd here, so reign, sky god, if you wish. The stakes are driven in, unshakable, said Dhaniya. The grass halters are new and well woven. Not even the sucklings can break them. So reign, sky god, if you wish. Like a bull, I broke the bonds, said the Buddha. Like an elephant, I snapped the vine. I will never lie in a womb again, so reign, sky god, if you wish. Right then, A thundercloud rained down, soaking the uplands and valleys. Hearing the sky god rain down, Dharaniya said this: "It is no small gain for us that we've seen the Buddha. We come to you for refuge, clear-eyed one. O great sage, please be our teacher. My wife and I, obedient, shall lead the spiritual life under the Holy One. Gone beyond birth and death, we shall make an end of suffering." "Your children bring you delight," said Mara the wicked. "Your cattle also bring you delight. For attachments are a man's delight. Without attachments, there's no delight." "Your children bring you sorrow," said the Buddha. "Your cattle also bring you sorrow. For attachments are a man's sorrow. Without attachments, there are no sorrows." So this is the Daniya Sutta. And so just some initial reflections on it. Number one, I'm not sure if you can see, but it started raining down while I was reading that here in Sydney. So we're now in the middle of a big downpour of rain. I'm not going to claim that there is any correlation or whatever, but that's just what's happening, okay? So a number of things we can say about this to begin with. So first of all, you can see that this sutta has this kind of call and response form to it, which kind of sounds a bit like a song, or sounds a bit like a popular ballad. Sometimes it's been described as like a pastoral ballad. And so it has this kind of almost like, a challenge and counter-challenge feel to it, but quite sort of gently phrased. So it's very much a conversation, as I was mentioning before. It's an exchange between the Buddha and Dharaniya, and it's presenting their two very different points of view. So one of the things that you can see about talking to the Buddha, I can imagine like when we think about the Buddha, we think of the Buddha as so sacred and so holy, but honestly, sometimes it could be very annoying to talk to the Buddha, because you can see that whatever Dharaniya says, the Buddha just takes it and then turns it to the exact opposite meaning, right? And so he's very clever at doing this kind of thing. And so you can see that in doing that, this is a characteristic of the Buddha's approach to dialogue. He always found something in common with the person that he's speaking to. Right? This is something we'll see every time we do this. He'll identify, oh, we have this, we can find this sort of point. Even in this case, it might be, say, the literary style, right? So they're almost like they're playing this game together. And so even though he's contradicting him, but he's actually contradicting him in this quite playful manner that's kind of an engaging, because he's the ability to transform it, right? To transform what Dharaniya said means that he was listening to what Dharaniya said. Right? So it's actually from an empathetic and creative point of view that this is working. So I'll just give a very short remark on the structure of Buddhist textual collections. One of the characteristic things you find often is that Buddhist text collections begin with a difficult and forbidding sutta, and then the second one is quite nice and engaging. And you find that in the Digha Nikaya, you find that in the Majjhima Nikaya, and you find that here in the Sutta Nipata as well. The first sutta in Sutta Nipata is quite a challenging and difficult sutta, and then this second one, much more engaging, much more kind of popular flavor to it. And so you can see that the Buddha's teaching here is very, how do I put this? He's speaking to Dharaniya on his level. So he wants to come to him and talk to him on his level. So let's go back and look at the sutta again. So Vandana asks, a good question, thank you for that. May I ask who is listening and recording this dialogue? Mostly it's Ananda, and it starts as thus I've heard. Good point. So the tradition says that Ananda was the Buddha's closest disciple, who was his attendant and was with him in many of the events of his life, especially in the last part of his life. And it was Ananda who recited the suttas after the Buddha's death, when they put them into a form that they could memorize. So according to the tradition, Ananda prefaced each sutta with the words, thus have I heard, which indicates that he was the one who was present and who memorized the sutta. Like many of the things in tradition, that's not quite correct, because the word thus I have heard doesn't mean that you were present in the sutta. In fact, when you say in Pali, "Thus have I heard," what you're saying is, "I was not there, but I heard it." There is another phrase that we use to indicate that you're present, which is "Sammukha me bhagavato sutang." I heard this from the Blessed One, or in the presence of the Blessed One. So if Ananda really did hear all these, then that's what he would have used. So eva me sutang actually is a tag signifying that this is an oral tradition. This particular sutta, as with most of the suttas in the Sutta Nipata, is purely a set of verses, and it lacks such an opening tag. So we are left to our own inferences as to what happened here. So it's most likely that these suttas were simply recited at the first council, but weren't tagged with that kind of introduction, or possibly also that might have been added later. I don't really have any reason to suspect this particular sutta was added later, but it's always possible. If it was added later, it wasn't added much later for reasons, as I've already indicated, because it does indicate the Buddha in conversation with someone who wasn't a Buddhist. Sorry, Robin asks, what are the 3 types of texts I just mentioned? Sorry, what 3 types of texts? Did I mention 3 types of texts? Can you clarify for me? Sorry, if you can clarify that question, I'll answer through it.
There are some Tripitaka.
Tripitaka, yeah. The three baskets, the 3 Tripitaka. Okay, yeah. So the Tripitaka, which is the 3. Okay, so in the Theravada tradition, we have the Tripitaka, which is the Vinaya, which is the code of conduct for monks and nuns. We have the Suttas, which is what we're doing now, and we have the Abhidhamma, which is the systematic treatise. All right. And the Abhidhamma was added later. So originally it was the Suttas and Vinaya. Abhidhamma was added a couple of 100 years later. So in the Chinese and Tibetan traditions, they also have this notion of the Tripitaka, but the way that Tripitaka is formed is quite different. But they still include the Suttas and the Vinaya as part of that Tripitaka. Yeah. The tag I mentioned, the tag is, as mentioned by Vandana, that many suttas begin conventionally with "Thus have I heard," evam me sutang. And so that's like a little tag that identifies, it's like a kind of metadata that says this sutta was handed down through the oral tradition. Okay. All right. Shall we continue? Let us continue. Okay. I'm going to share the screen again. So Dhaniya Sutta, the wealthy rancher. Okay, so this is giving us something about who Dhaniya is. So I'm coming to you from Australia, and in Australia we have many wealthy ranchers, and I believe that many of you are from the United States, where you also have many wealthy ranchers. Right? So these are people with large acreages and many cows, and it's kind of curious, I think, that with all of the changes that we have in society and economies and politics and technologies and everything, but owning a lot of land and having a lot of cows on that land is still a marker of wealth and prestige. I'm just actually going to come back from the screen sharing. So, in obviously, this was one of the major sources of wealth in the India of the time of the Buddha. Was cattle raising, and even though today, when we think of India, people think of the sacred cow, and people think that Hindus would not eat beef, but that wasn't the case in the time of the Buddha. The history of the sacred cow is actually quite a sort of complex one. There certainly was some idea that the cow was a specially sacred creature. In the Brahmana Dhammika Sutta, in the Sutta Nipata, the Brahmins induced the kings to offer sacrifices, and the worst sacrifice that they could make was the sacrifice of the cow. And when the cow was sacrificed, the gods cried out, "Adhammo," this is against the Dhamma, this is against nature. So there certainly was an idea that cows were considered to be gentle and harmless and worthwhile creatures, but you didn't really have the idea of the sacred cow. And certainly slaughtering cattle was a normal thing. We find in the suttas mention commonly of the Goghatako, the cattle butcher, and the Goghatakantevasi, the cattle butcher's apprentice, meaning that there was an actual trade, a craft that was handed down of cattle butchery. So Yeah, it's complicated, isn't it? Because today we have a whole range of environmental and animal welfare considerations that don't necessarily apply in the time of the Buddha. I won't speak on the American situation, which I'm sure you know better than I do. But in Australia, just one little anecdote. A few years ago, I led a retreat in the centre of Australia, and if you go to a centre of Australia, it's full of cattle ranches. When I say it's full of cattle ranches, what I mean is you can't see a single cow anywhere. But like if you travel like 20 miles over in that direction, maybe you'll see a cow. I mean, they're very large properties. You know, you have to sort of get in your private plane and fly to your neighbour's house to have dinner with them. If you go there, you know, you're driving through this country where you rarely, if ever, see any cattle. All you see is the desert with the desert grasses on there. And one of the things that I learned from our tour guides on that trip was that everything that you see is not natural. In Central Australia, you go out to the desert, all of the grasses are introduced. So these are all African grasses which grow more densely so that they can feed the cows. And the Australian grasses are all being out competed, which means that affects all of the insect life, all of the other life, the bird life and everything. And when I was living on the community out there at Lilla in the centre of Australia, I was with one of the Aboriginal guys who had been born on that property. And one morning we were sitting there just looking out on the land, and I'm there like, wow, here I am in the sort of primordial nature, a million miles from anywhere that humans have touched. And he just sort of remarked, he said, you know, he said, everything here is different than when I was a boy. Everything here, nothing here is the same. The bird noises are not the same, the animal noises, the insect noises, the plants, the flowers, everything is different. So that's the impact of cattle ranching in Australia, in Central Australia. So let us return to Dania. I've boiled my rice and drawn my milk, said Dania the rancher. I stay with my family along the bank of the Mahi. My hut is roofed, my sacred fire kindled. So rain, sky god, if you wish. Okay, so there's quite a bit to unpack here. So first of all, let's talk about the Mahi River. And the Buddha is also kind of staying there. Now, the Mahi River is one of the many rivers that comes from the Himalayas down to the Ganges, and the Mahi is a notoriously dangerous river. In fact, it's known sometimes as the what is it? The bane of Bihar. It has an extremely unpredictable route. It will overflow its banks. It will flood, and at its worst, will cause devastating floods that will kill or displace thousands of people. And that happened in Bihar about a decade ago when there was a terrible flood on the Mahi River. I can't remember the modern name of it, but that's the river that they're on. So this to me gives a very kind of rich context to what the Buddha and what Dania are talking about. Dania is talking about how secure he is and so on and so forth. And I mean, he kind of has a slightly thou dost protest too much feeling about him, right? Nobody's telling him that you're under threat. And yet here he is saying how safe he is and how secure he is. And this, I think, is the implicit context. Actually, he's not safe because the Mahi is a huge, genuine threat. And we'll see this imagery drawn out through the sutta. And of course, towards the end of the sutta, this is why when the thunderstorm appears, then that provokes such a dramatic reaction. Because the thunderstorm is not just thunder and rain, it's a flood. And that can take away their whole livelihood. Okay, the second thing to notice here is that the description evidently refers to his completion of the daily household rite, the griha ritual, which involves offering of cooked food and guaranteeing abundant cattle and offspring. And you can look the reference here to the Shatapatha Brahmana 1.8.1.9, which I will explain in just a minute. He also says here that his fire is kindled, ahitogini. So the Sanskrit phrase is ahitagni. So this is somebody who has set up their fire altar. So if we read this kind of naively or without understanding of the context, it sounds like someone who's just saying, oh, well, I've boiled my rice, I've boiled my milk, and I've got my fire burning, and I've got my family, and now I'm happy, which is all true. That's all what's happened. But there's another religious layer to what he's doing. What he's saying is that he has performed his duty as a householder. He has done the right thing. He has not just farmed his cattle and looked after his family and done all of those things. He's also done that in the sight of the gods, and he has appeased the gods through his righteous offering. And so this is giving a spiritual dimension to what he is saying, without which I think we lose a whole level of meaning in the sutta. And this is why at the end he says Pavasa Deva, so rain, sky god, if you wish. So this is a kind of this idiom is an idiom we find in the suttas. That's the kind of an ambiguous idiom where deva is felt to mean the sky, and so can refer to just the natural phenomenon of the rain, but can also refer to the god of the sky or the divinity of the sky. And so Danya, in this case, clearly is invoking the divinity of the sky. It's not just saying, well, I'm secure here, so I don't care if it rains. He's saying now is the time for the rain god to rain, because I have done my duties, and the rain god's blessing will allow me to continue to be abundant and fertile in this land. So this, I think, is really crucial, and especially I think it's crucial when we come to the later part of the sutta and we see that Danya converts to Buddhism. And if we read it without that religious context, his conversion seems very sudden and abrupt. All of a sudden, one time he's boiling his rice, and the next minute he's saying, oh, there's a bit of thunder in the sky, and he says, oh, now I'm going to be a Buddhist. There's no real context for that. So this is supplying that missing context. This is why this wasn't just him looking after his land. This was him being a servant of the gods and realizing that the gods perhaps were not looking after him in the way that he was looking after them. Now, coming back to the opening of that, I gave a reference to the Shadapada Brahmana 1.8.1.9. I'm now going to stop my screen sharing for a minute and just come back and talk a little bit about that and about the texts that we're referring to when we're referring to non-Buddhist texts of that time, okay? So we're talking 2,500 years ago, all right? So that's a long time. Most of what we know of as Hindu texts or Jain texts come from a lot later. Things like Mahabharata, Bhagavad Gita, Ramayana, and so on. These are all later. They might have roots earlier, but the texts themselves are later. The actual texts that we have that are earlier are fairly restricted in number, and they consist of mostly the three Vedas, the oldest literature, then a literature called the Brahmanas, of which the most important is the Shadapada Brahmana, which we just referred to, and that gives the details of the ritual. And finally, the Upanishads, or some of the early Upanishads, which are the contemplative literature. So these are the three main forms of literature that are pre-Buddhist. Then we have some other literature that is around the same time or a bit later, so the grammars and the Artha Shastra of Kautilya. So there's some other things from around that time. A lot of that literature is not as well studied as the Buddhist literature, and it can be a bit of a hassle to look things up, to figure out where to get started, and so on and so forth. So I spend half my life these days looking up these things, and so it's not easy. But I'm just going to give you a tip if you want to get started. So this is the Shadapada Brahmana. Great. I'm going to, I don't think I'm screen sharing anymore. I'm going to right-click that. I don't have a link, but if I search for it, what happens if I search for that? In fact, I'm just going to screen share this because this is actually maybe useful for you. All right, so we can see I've highlighted the Shadapada Brahmana with the note there. And then you read this, you read these handy notes that I've given you. And you think, okay, so you've referenced that, but what is that? I don't know what that is. How do I find that? How can I look what that is? So let's just try, let's do the easiest possible thing. Highlight it, search, we'll DuckDuckGo it. And there, boom. Shatapada Brahmana, verse 1.8.9 in the Wisdom Library. By the way, I'm just going to say this right for now. The Wisdom Library is an awesome collection run by one guy in, I think, Holland in his spare time. And so I use it like all the time. So I've just clicked on that, but it doesn't seem to be opening. While that is, not sure if there's a Wi-Fi issue or an issue with their server, but while that's just opening, so the Shatapada Brahmana is an extremely extensive collection of instructions and details, mostly about rituals, and is attributed to the great sage Yajnavalkya. And it is not opening. I'll try the internet, the sacred text link. Looks like there's a problem with the Wisdom Lib server there. Shatapada 1.8.1.9. All right, so I'm now, the Wisdom Library seems to be down. It's not good. But anyway, we have the same text here on the Sacred Text Archive. And I'll just read, this is the paragraph to which I was referring before. So Manu said to her, "Who art thou?" "Thy daughter," she replied. "How, illustrious one, art thou my daughter?" he asked. She replied, "Those offerings of clarified butter, sour milk, whey, and curds, which thou madest in the waters, with them thou hast begotten me. I am the blessing. Make use of me at the sacrifice. If you will make use of me at the sacrifice, you will become rich in offspring and cattle. Whatever blessing that you invoke through me, all of that shall be granted to you." He accordingly made use of her as the benediction in the middle of the sacrifice, for what is intermediate between the fore offerings and the after offerings is the middle of the sacrifice. So this is just an example of the kind of thing that we find in the Shatapada Brahmana. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail, but you can see that there it's talking about those same kinds of offerings and the prosperity and so on that it's giving. So you see an example of what's happening from his side. This is the crucial thing here. We're not just looking at it from the Buddha's side. So this is what we tend to do from the Buddhist tradition. We look at it from the Buddhist side. We say, oh yeah, the Buddha was right. I'm on the Buddhist side. We're like, go team, right? Ha ha, you sure told Danya, right? That sure told him. And like, this is not a rat beef, okay? This is not about who gets to win by who has the most clever comeback or something like that. This is a spiritual conversation. And so to understand a spiritual conversation, we want to have empathy for both sides. Have to have empathy for where Danya is coming from, right? Danya was no fool. He's clearly articulate, he's intelligent, he's hardworking, he cares, right? But he believes in this system, which is very persuasively being taught to him. And it's not easy to change your mind in these things. And simply coming along and saying, oh, your ritual is no good or whatever, is not really a very effective way of dealing with people from a different religious background. So instead, we have to sort of understand, why is it that this matters to these people? So let's just think about this for a minute. So we don't know anything much about Danya's background, where he came from or anything like that. But we do know that he's very proud of his station, he's very proud of his work, proud of what he's been able to accomplish. And, fair enough, not easy to establish a good life and a good livelihood. It's a lot of hard work for a long time. Being a farmer is extremely hard work. So good on him for doing all of that. One of the things that we forget, we live in a world of dust. We live in a world where we have stripped meaning from nature, and where we see water is H2O and sand is silicon, and what makes things grow is nitrogen and a bunch of chemicals. And if you want to grow a farm, then drive a machine over it and throw some chemicals into it. And so we live in this world of dust where machines and technology are that which we place our faith in. Yeah? The world, that's a very new world. That's a very strange world, historically. And most people have not lived in that kind of world. So in the kind of world that Danya was living in, everything around him was imbued with sacred meaning. When the rain came from the sky, it wasn't just a process of water and evaporation and so on. It was the gods. There was something sacred to it, something purposeful. And when the sun shone, right, it was the warm blessing of the god who shone upon him. When the rice sprouted from the ground, it was the blessings of the earth goddess who was giving him her generosity. So you're surrounded by meaning. And all of those deities have their stories. They're all connected to astrology. They're connected to the stars. They're connected to the rituals that he's performing. And so as you could see there, that he's performing a ritual, and then that ritual is connected with a particular story in the Shatapatha Brahmana. So these are all things that convey values, they convey meaning, they convey a sense of continuity, they convey a sense of community, a sense of tradition, a sense of belonging. You know, all of those things that we don't have anymore. All of the things that we've decided that we're so clever that we don't have to do those things now. And this is how people created those things. It's not a secret. This is how cultures worked. And so I think it's really important to look at this from an empathetic point of view and to see that actually, you know, he had a sacred belief system through which his performance of ritual created a connection with all of these things around him. And in that Brahmanical literature, that word connection is sandhi. And this is one of the most important words in that whole tradition, sandhi. Everything is connected to everything else. And so they would go through all of the rituals and then point to the fact that every detail in the verse connects with something in the real world, connects with something that's happening. And you can look at those connections and you think often they appear bizarre and arbitrary. But to criticize the connections for being unscientific is to kind of miss the point. What they mean is that you are participating in that great story, that divine story, and you have a role to play that sacred meaning in the story. So this is where Dharniya is coming from, right? This is his just unquestioned assumptions, right? He probably didn't even think of it in that way. Right? Maybe he did, but it probably didn't. It's just how things work. It's just how culture conditions you to think. Of course, you're a part of that divine story. And of course, because you have done the right thing, made your offerings to the gods, then they're going to look after you. Obviously. Or maybe not, as we're about to discover further on. Let's continue. Right, so the Buddha continues. So the Buddha... we don't get really the context for this, but assuming the Buddha was wandering about the place, the Mahi River was north of the Ganges, so not far from the regular districts that the Buddha wandered in, probably in the Vajjian Republic at the moment. I boil not with anger and have drawn out hard-heartedness. So the Buddha, in the footnotes here, that even though in translation you can't quite capture this, but the Buddha is actually responding to the statements there. I'm going to put the Pali here so that you can actually get the pun. And I'm going to take away the notes for a second. Okay, so you can see the puns here. So the Dhaniya said, I've boiled my rice, pakkodano, to which the Buddha replied, akkodano. And meaning that he has boiled not with anger, a different word, but he's punning on Dhaniya's question. And Vigadak kilo hamasmi in response to Dudha kiro hamasmi. Kira is milk, kila hard-heartedness or barrenness. So that's obviously the Buddha kind of showing off a bit and demonstrating his skill with the language and so on. But also actually more than that. I mentioned before that the Buddha's response was kind of playful and creative. And that ability to play with words and be creative is highly valued in the Vedic tradition. So the Vedas are full of this kind of thing. And they use extremely sophisticated wordplay and literary devices and so on, which are just honestly just astonishingly complex and accomplished in their literary qualities, quite apart from what it is they're saying, but in terms of how they're saying it. So we can see that the Buddha he's playing their game, right? He's engaging with Dhanya using the kind of playful exchange, which is very much Vedic in its inspiration. So whereas Dhanya lives permanently there, Buddha just stays for one night on the bank of the Mahi, and the Buddha always wandering. And my hut is wide open, my fire is quenched. And so again here the Buddha directly contrasting the quenching of his fire, the nibbana of his fire, with the kindling of the fire in the Vedic sacrifice. So this is one of those things where you see that use of the imagery of fire for nibbana is directly meant to counteract that idea that of the fire worship, which is so fundamental to Vedic religiosity. And so the Buddha, turning everything upside down, he seeks security and safety not in those externals, but in his own freedom, inner freedom. And that's why, but he joins with Dhanya in saying, so reign, sky god, if you wish. Dhanya continues, no gadflies or mosquitoes are found, cows graze on the lush meadow grass. They get by even when the rain comes. So reign, sky god, if you wish. Now this particular one is kind of curious because the Buddha's response doesn't seem to really directly reply to Dhanya's verse. This is the only verse in this poem where that happens. So it's not entirely clear why that's the case. Okay, Norman, and as Norman points out this verse is not a proper response. Maybe a verse has been lost. It's a bit hard to say exactly what's going on. For those of you who are not familiar, K.R. Norman, who I'm referring to here, was one of the great scholars of Pali in the 20th century and translated most of the Pali verses. So he's considered to be the expert in Pali poetry. So we're not entirely sure why these two verses don't, like why the Buddha doesn't directly respond to Dhanya's verse here. Anyway, what the Buddha does say is, I bound a raft and made it well, and with it I crossed over, went to the far shore and dispelled the flood. Now I have no need for a raft inside which. So you can see that imagery inspired by the presence of the Mahi River and the threat posed by flooding. You see this happens a lot in the suttas. These imagery of floods is a major set of imagery here, particularly in the collection called the Parayanavagga of the Sutta Nipata, which has a similar context because the 16 Brahmins of that sutta used to live by the Godavari River in the south of India, which is also highly flood prone. So the verses there constantly talking about the same kind of imagery we see here, binding a raft, crossing the flood, getting to the far shore, and so on. When the Buddha says he has no need of a raft, then this is echoing the very famous simile of the raft. And the Buddha in the Majjhima Nikaya said that the teachings are meant as a raft for crossing over and not for holding on to. And so he said that if you need to cross a river, you need to make a raft to get across the river. But once you've got across, do you then pick up the raft and then carry it with you, or do you set the raft free? And so the point here is that we should not be attached to the letter of the teachings, but we should be using the teachings for the purpose of crossing over. So all of this imagery, to cross over, go to the far shore, dispel the flood, these are all synonyms for nibbana. And you can see again that the imagery, the way that the Buddha talked about nibbana responds to, we've already seen that the going out of the fire responds to the religious practices of fire worship. And here we're seeing that the ideas of crossing over, going to the far shore and so on, and dispelling the flood are responding to the geography of the time. So these are metaphors that have very much a meaning for that time and that place. Of course, flood, still being very much a threat today. Australia had, east coast of Australia had many terrible floods in the last couple of years. Okay, so now Dania comes back. My wife is obedient, not wanton. Just a quick word on obedient here. So up until recently, obviously in the Western marriage vows, it was common for women to say they love, cherish and obey, and men, I guess, sometimes would say that as well. Not quite sure. The exact meaning of the word is not quite obedient, but more means somebody who listens. So obviously that you could say that's a bit sexist. Well, he was a Brahmin from 2,500 years ago. He wanted his wife to obey him. Not particularly unusual, but also I think interesting that when they go to the end of it, that Dhanya says that they will both be obedient to the teachings of the Buddha. So they'll both be kind of pliant and listening to the teachings of the Buddha. Long have we lived together happily. Digharatang sangvasya manapa. I hear nothing bad about her, so reign, sky god, if you wish. So good on him. He's got a successful marriage and he's happy living with his wife. Not easy to do. The Buddha responds, my mind is obedient and freed, long nurtured and well tamed. Nothing bad is found in me. So reign, sky god, if you wish. Moving on, I'm self-employed. And my healthy children likewise. I hear nothing bad about them, so reign, sky god, if you wish. And the Buddha said, I'm no one's lackey. With what I've earned, I wander the world. I've no need for wages, so reign, sky god, if you wish. So here the Buddha is referring to the fact that he became enlightened by himself. He didn't follow anybody else's teaching. And that because of that, there's this idea that if you become free from attachments to the world, then you live as somebody who's freed from the burden of debt. So for somebody like myself, who is very much not free from the attachments to the world, and is still very much struggling along the path of finding that freedom, then I'm still racking up debt. So I still have like student debt accruing, if you will, if I might dare to make that metaphor. So we kind of, as long as we're on the path as a monastic, so when I'm taking the alms food that's offered by people, or when I'm using requisites and so on, then I am, as it were, taking on my student loans and having, through my practice and the integrity of my sila, then paying the interest of that. But I don't really pay it off completely until you become an arahant. So moving on, Dhanya then starts to list all of his stock. I have heifers and sucklings, cows and calf and breeding cows. I've also got a bull, leader of the herd here. So reign, sky god, if you wish. And the Buddha's response here, very simple. I have no heifers or sucklings, no cows and calf or breeding cows, no bull, leader of the herd here. The stakes are driven in, unshakable. The grass halters are new and well woven. Not even the sucklings can break them. So reign, sky god, if you wish. So here he's referring to the fact that his cattle are under control. His stock is under control. He's got all the things he needs so that they're not going to break free. But like the bull, I broke the bonds, said the Buddha. Like an elephant, I snapped the butt. So the Buddha became free, no matter how strong those bonds are, tying you down to place, tying you down to people, tying you down to things, tying you down to your attachments. Then the power of Dhamma is enough to be able to break those open. Naham puna pesang gabhaseyang. I'll never lie in a room again. So this is talking about how he won't be reborn. And this is a similar idiom that you find in the Metta Sutta, towards the end of the Metta Sutta. So reign, sky god, if you wish. Right then, a thundercloud rained down, soaking the uplands and valleys. Hearing the sky god rain down, Dhanya said this: So here we see the very abrupt conversion that I mentioned before. It's no small gain for us that we've seen the Buddha. We've come to you for refuge, clear-eyed one, O great sage, please be our teacher. So I mean, it feels to me like there's maybe a verse that's missing. Maybe you'd expect to hear, or at least a line or two, something like, hearing the sky god rain down, Dania was terrified and turned to the Buddha in refuge, or something like this. Feels like there's maybe a break in the narrative that could be expanded a bit, but in any case, the basic sense of it is pretty clear. It's no small gain for us that we've seen the Buddha. We come to you for refuge, clear-eyed one, O great sage, please be our teacher. I mean, there is something realistic about this, in the sense that if you look at how people argue and how people discuss things, right, people will stick to their position. You say A and they say B, and you say A and they say B, and you say A and they say B, and that's how it kind of goes. But at the same time, kind of underneath, we're kind of like, oh, yeah, that kind of was a good point that they made, even though I really wouldn't want to admit it. But maybe I do actually see things from their point of view a little bit. And so sometimes that process of changing your mind actually happens a lot sort of subconsciously, or at least not verbally, sort of building up gradually before it actually comes out in public. So I think that's not as perhaps abrupt as one might imagine. Dani goes on, my wife and I, obedient, shall live the spiritual life under the Holy One. Gone beyond birth and death, we shall make an end of suffering. So it appears to be saying that they're both going to go forth as bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, both because they said that they're going to live the brahmacharya, but also because they're going to practice for the ending of suffering. So this is typically something that is associated with those who've gone forth. I mean, it could be meant a bit more generally, that they were simply going to live as devoted Buddhists under the Buddha. But I think most likely it indicates that they wanted to actually ordain at the end there. Finally, we have this little tag of these couple of verses at the end from Mara. I'm going to guess these verses are probably added on later. We find similar verses a number of places in the suttas and the Vinaya. Your children bring you delight, your cattle bring you delight. For attachments are a man's delight. Without attachments, there's no delight. So the word for attachment here is upadi. And so upadi means both the inner grasping and desire for things, but also the external things to which we become attached. And the Buddha again flips the dialogue. Your children bring you sorrow, your cattle also bring you sorrow. For attachments are a man's sorrow. Without attachments, there are no sorrows. So one of the things about this kind of dialogue, just to bear in mind, is that the Buddha is not trying to say that children bring you only sorrow and no happiness, okay? He's just giving you a point of reflection that actually there are always two sides to these things. And so the Buddha said that to understand things, you should see first of all, the gratification. That means the pleasure and the happiness that things can bring you, and also the danger, right? The drawback and the suffering and the pain that they can bring you, and also the escape from those things, which is the letting go of attachment. So don't kind of over-interpret this. The Buddha is simply saying that as long as you have children, cattle, and other things that are attached, then there will be suffering with that. And so that's okay. Suffering is all right. And, suffering is natural. It's normal. It's okay. But just don't try to convince yourself that you're not going to be suffering, right? Because then that's just going to make you more disappointed in the end. So this is the Dhanya Sutta. And so the wealthy rancher who was so proud of his accomplishments, so happy to have all of those nice things that he had. These days, he'd probably be driving around in one of those big trucks that they have and like listening to country music or something like that, and then thinking about how great it was that he could, I don't know, something like that. But he does seem to be a bit of a man of culture as well, right? So he had a religious practice and a spiritual practice, and that was the sense of meaning that he had in his work. He wasn't just about he wasn't purely just a hedonist or a materialist, but there was a spiritual meaning to what he was doing as well. So this is the Dhanya Sutta, and I hope this has been helpful and perhaps amusing. And please feel free to comment or give any feedback. Meanwhile, I'm going to look at the chat and look at the questions that people have asked there. So we've got about, I think, 10 minutes to go. So please do pop any questions if you have any more. Okay. So from Dana, we have, I'm not sure which Dana this is. I know a lot of Danas, or a few Danas anyway. Hi, Dana, wherever you are. Let's see if I can see Dana. Not sure if I can see Dana, but anyway, all right. So Dana asks, when were the text's class materials for this 4-time meetings established? Where are we now? Collected and written down after 100 years after the Buddha passed away. Okay, so the so how that process went was something like this. Of course, we don't, obviously there's a lot of uncertainty with all of these things, so we can just reconstruct it as best as we know. So during the time of the Buddha, the community would listen to his teachings and they would memorize them. Now, the teachings that were given were designed to be memorized. This is a crucial point. You can even see this in the Dhamma Sutta that we're listening to, that we read today. And you have that stereotyped response that gives you a structure, so that helps you to memorize things. You have the tagline at the end, it's also a mnemonic device. You have the fact that there are like lines in one verse that will echo a line in the other verse, and so on and so forth. So all of these are mnemonic devices. It's the use of these mnemonic devices is why one of the reasons why you can remember songs, because songs do all of these kinds of things. And so that's why you can remember a song you heard, decades ago, and the words will still come to you. And so these suttas are designed in order to be memorized, and so they employ all of these different mnemonic techniques to make them memorizable. And so they were remembered during the Buddha's life by various students, by the monks, by the nuns, by the lay people, in a semi-organized fashion. Now, after the Buddha passed away, the Sangha got together in Rajagaha and they held what we call the first council. And at the first council, they decided that they were going to systematize the recitation of these texts in order to ensure that they would be preserved for future generations. And so they organized them. We don't know exactly all of the details, but ultimately they were organized into the form that we have them today in the Tripitaka with the suttas that we're looking at today. So they were preserved through the oral tradition from that time. One thing to bear in mind, and I just want to mention this because this is I mentioned at the beginning of the class that we read things through our own projections, right, through our own experience. Most people are very bad at memorizing things. Okay, I'm not going to point to any particular individuals here, but I certainly know that as a young monk when I was at Thailand, that most of the Western monks were terrible at memorizing things. And when it would come to remembering suttas and remembering passages of Pali, we were very bad at it. Why? Obviously because that's the kind of education that we had. I was really good at memorizing things. Why? Because I was a musician. And I learned to memorize songs. I could listen to an album a couple of times and be able to memorize all the songs on it. And that was a skill that I'd learned from years of playing and practicing music. So this is a trainable skill. So the fact that we can't memorize things very well doesn't mean that other people couldn't. These were passed out in the oral tradition. There's no reason to think that oral tradition is any less reliable than any other kind of tradition. In fact, in my view, the reliability of transmission is primarily affected not by the means of transmission, but by the care that the people who are doing it have taken. Now, you can use any kind of transmission can be done well or poorly, but if you put the care and the time and the effort, then you can do it well. So this is transmitted for a few hundred years, roughly 400 years or so, in the oral tradition. Gradually they would have been written down, but the first record we have of the whole Tripitaka being written down was about 20 BCE in the Alavihara in Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka had been afflicted by various calamities, including famine. And so they were afraid that they wouldn't have enough monks to be able to memorize things, so they decided to start writing them down. So since that time, for roughly 2,000 years, the tradition was mostly handed down by copying manuscripts. If you go to the Sutta Central homepage, then you can see a few examples of what those manuscripts look like. And in recent years, of course, they were printed in books and now in digital format. Okay. Vandana mentions cows were considered to be mothers because their milk can be used for newborn babies. Exactly. And so there's definitely, if you look in the Brahmana Dhamma Sutta, there's this very kind of tender and very loving sort of feeling about the cow, that the cow would never harm anybody and would be only ever gave us her milk. And so, yeah. Okay. Approaching the end, Pat says, thanks so much. This enriches the study. Very grateful. Looking forward to more. Well, thank you so very much, Pat. It's always nice to know that you're appreciated. Kaz mentions, how's it going, Kaz? Good to see you. Is the Buddha denying there's something spiritual, not necessarily particularly gods, towards the nature, right? It's a good question. So the Buddha, in a sense, he was kind of secularizing the world in the same way that we do today, right? He presented a world that operated according to laws, according to systems, according to movement of energies. And it's a very kind of modern way of thinking about it. And today we think about the environment in the same way. It's an ecosystem and there's energies moving and so on and so forth. And so that older way of creating a spiritual connection with nature through the identification of divinity in nature, no longer applies in Buddhism, or at least doesn't really apply in that same way. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a spiritual connection with nature, because that spiritual connection comes from our experience and understanding of ourselves as part of that system. So we have a different kind of spiritual connection. So for example, when we do mindfulness of breathing meditation, we breathe in from the air around us and we breathe out. And that makes us a part of the nature that we are surrounded by. And so we have different ways of approaching that from a Buddhist point of view. But I think that's a really interesting question. It's certainly a question that deserves a more in-depth response. But I do believe that if we are to have a more meaningful approach to things like climate change, environmental challenges, and so on, then we need to go beyond just a purely instrumental way of thinking about it. We need to have a sense of meaning of who we are in relation to the land that we live on. Okay, very good. So Wimala asks, where can we find and buy linked discourses? So if you're interested in the sort of central versions of the discourses, you can get them from the sort of central home page, where there's a link to our publications project, but I'll supply the link there for you anyway, and you can order them all from there. I'm just going to put this link in the group chat. Okay. Next question, is this sutta from one of the Nikayas? I probably should have done this in more detail, it looks like. So yes, this is from the 5th Nikaya. So I mentioned before that we have the Tripitaka, so the Vinaya, which is the code of discipline, suttas, which is the discourses, and the Abhidhamma, which is the systematic treatise. Now we're dealing with the suttas, okay, just this one, middle one. Now those suttas are divided into 5. 4 Nikayas, long, middle, linked, and numbered discourses. We're not in any of them. We're in the 5th Nikaya. This is the Khuddaka Nikaya. Khuddaka Nikaya has a bunch of texts in it. How many? 18 or something like that. And so this is one of those 18 texts in the Khuddaka Nikaya. So it's a Sutta Nipata in the Khuddaka Nikaya of the Sutta Pitaka. Okay? Bit confusing, I know. Okay. Sume asks, Dear Ajahn, do you know why conversations with non-Buddhists stopped later on? Good question. Look, I'm guessing it's because Buddhism was pretty successful and most of the people around them were Buddhists, and you become a bit lazy, you can become a bit complacent, and it's easy to talk to people who think the same as you do. it's easy for monks and nuns, then it's a lot easier to talk to Buddhist people. You share a common language and a set of assumptions, whereas talking to people who are not Buddhists is more challenging. You have to sort of put, and so I think there are probably a variety of reasons for that. But I think it's a fascinating question. We all know that India is, as it always has been, incredibly diverse in its religions and philosophies and so on. And this is very much reflected in the suttas, but not in the later literature. Pat asks, how long after the Buddha's passing was the first council? Not long, a few months afterwards. So they basically, when the Buddha died, they determined that they needed to have a council and organized it, and they went down to Rajagaha and they held it there in Rajagaha. Okay, so I think that's about it. I think we've managed to just answer all of the questions in the chat, and we're just at 1.5 hours. Wow, amazing. Don't get the mistaken impression that this was well organized or anything like that. This is just pure luck. Okay. All right. So thanks everybody. Thanks Rob. Thanks everybody for attending, and I really look forward to next week. And for the coming weeks, we'll be doing the suttas. Will be getting gradually a bit harder and a bit more complicated. For those of you, especially if you want to continue, if you're not, if you're feeling a bit lost and you're not really sure, of some of those fundamentals of how we're approaching things, may I suggest, first of all, have a look on Sutta Central on our homepage, and you'll find some sort of introductory guides and some things like that that may be a bit of help for you. And if you still need some help or you still got some questions, then please do come by our Sutta Central forum. And there you can ask, and don't be afraid to ask like beginners questions or anything like that, and people will come along and help you there. So that's why we have that forum, to give you some context, because I know that it can be a lot, and sometimes, like myself, I've been working in this area for such a long time that I forget, I take for granted a lot of things. So please, thank you for asking those questions, and please do keep asking them as much as you can. All right, thanks everybody. See you next week. May you be happy. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Thank you, Ajahn. Thank you so much.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Sadhu, thank you.
Sadhu.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you.